very much. Some of what we've just seen, fascinating diagrams, probably will interact with some of what we are going to hear now from some of the people who are intimately involved in what we are calling BOOMTOWN today. I'd like to, if our panellists could come up, and they're going to sit over here, and there'll be also a potential to take your questions, and I'll introduce them now for you. I'll go through our 5 panellists because this is all about livability. Maryanne Graham is with the Sydney Motor Corporation, WestConnex, the Director of Communications and Stakeholder Engagement. We also have Ian Hunt, who is the CEO of the Moorebank Intermodal. This is, of course, this massive new transport. And Ian, just put your hand up so we all know who everyone is, in case Maryanne's on the end. Ian Hunt is the CEO of the Moorebank Intermodal, the new transport terminal, of course, which is such a massive, massive operation that it covers the precinct the size of the CBD. We also have Jonathan Myers. He's the head of growth and partnerships at Keolis Downer. They run Yarra Trams, the Gold Coast Light Rail, the Newcastle Light Rail. We have light rail coming, of course, to Western Sydney. They're also involved in buses, and buses are going to be quite important in the context of what we've just talked about, on-demand buses. There's also potentially driverless buses. So that's part of the solution as well. We also have Danny O'Connor. He's from the Western Sydney Local Health District, probably the only person on the panel that doesn't want to see an increase in his business in the future, but it is critical, of course, for a livable city. And Paul Higham, who is the head of service planning and asset strategy for Sydney Water. And there's a mix there because, first of all, Sydney Water is involved in infrastructure, but also it is crucial to cooling Western Sydney and providing the green space, which is so important. So would you make them all welcome now, if you could? We could just go along the panel here, if we could, to start off, because we're using this buzzword livability. How do they see Western Sydney developing, and how are we going to make it a more livable city given all of the changes that are happening now? And I guess the fundamental question for all, do you all talk to each other? Because ultimately, that's part of the problem, isn't it? Maryanne, can I start with you?
Thanks, John. I think today, when you listen to some of the speakers, you look at some of the terrific policy and strategy that's being developed across New South Wales, the stuff that the Greater Sydney Commission is doing in concert with Transport for New South Wales and other government agencies, that yes, and you know, it's a great time to be actually working in infrastructure in New South Wales because of the collaboration. It's the first time I've certainly seen this level of collaboration in sort of 20 odd years in the industry. And I think, you know, it's now that we can actually make some real headway and try to backfill, if you like, after what has been a fairly redundant period for infrastructure in the state. So yeah, I think the collaboration these days is actually really helping us to achieve great things for the state.
One of the issues, of course, is we all want everything in our supermarkets. We want everything moved very quickly, but we prefer to have no trucks at all on the roads. But they're there, they're moving around our roads. You're going to be shifting some of them. But Ian Hunt from this Moorebank Intermodal, the idea is we're going to have trucks moving from Port Botany to your freight terminal, and will there be fewer of them, will there, now that we're shifting to rail?
The answer is yes and no. And it's not fewer trucks overall, but it's very much slowing the growth of truck traffic. So to put some context around that, the Port of Botany is due to treble over the next 30 years, so 2.5 million containers a year, currently growing to about 7.5 million containers. But they can really only sustain that if 40% of those containers leave the port on a train. And so our role in that is providing a rail head for those trains to deliver the containers. That's about 3 million containers per annum on the rail rather than the road. That's still, though, doubling the current truck task. So while there will be a very significant proportion of future container freight trucks, containers on the rail rather than the road task will continue to grow.
Can I go to Jonathan Myers then, if I can, just on light rail, which has made a comeback in Sydney, and we know through the Inner West line, which people use in very large numbers. So light rail and buses, because you do both. Light rail, what's the advantage of light rail, say, over buses?
It's just a question of scale, so that they can move more people more quickly, and heavy rail can do it even faster. So it's really just a relativity of what's most appropriate for the capacity demands of a particular trunk route.
Is there a difference where light rail is sharing roads as opposed to having its own special route, which is designed for it specifically?
In terms of the general speed of traffic, if it's in mixed traffic is slower. So it's generally more efficient if it's on its own, but that's not always possible. And as we've seen through cities in Europe and North America and in Melbourne as well.
So where you've got light rail going in, for instance, is there enough? And we talked about this communication with what's happening elsewhere. So with the Western Metro, with the road projects, how that is going to interact, and are you able to talk to others as to where developments are, and where there's going to be the demand for your services?
Yeah, I think the concept of an operator-led development is much more common now, so that we can have input earlier on to say what will work best in the community, rather than having something designed and then we'll, giving it to operate. So I think we need to talk more.
Does the population hub come first and then you build the transport, or does the transport come in and then the population hub builds around that? I'd
like the idea that was being put forward earlier this morning about build the transport and then let the development happen around it. It doesn't often happen like that, but...
And what about what we just heard from Uber, the idea that Uber could work with your buses, for instance, which would be buses that are local buses that are on demand, that would interact with that and then move on to the light rail, then onto the trains?
Yeah, I think shared mobility is definitely the way transport is moving. Transport for New South Wales has put out a tender in the last 12 months, and we're part of that. It's not, there are many operators of shared mobility services.
Yep. Can I talk to Paul from Sydney Water? Because I had a renovation done 10 years ago, and at the end of it I said to the builder, where's the garden tap? And they'd actually forgotten the garden tap, so we had to dig a thing. How often does that happen, where you get forgotten? The water literally gets forgotten, or it's put right down the bottom as a priority, and it makes it more difficult for you.
Yeah, thanks, John. We've heard the talk today about the population growth and the infrastructure that is coming to service that population growth. We are in the dialogue as a water agency a lot in those conversations, but it's very much a secondary thought at this moment in time. And really, with Western Sydney particularly, it's the hottest, driest part, flattest part of the city, with 20 days or so a year over 35 degrees. We really need to rethink what water does to that environment and how we get the urban cooling and the urban greening that will make Western Sydney a livable place and a productive place. So really unlocking that potential early by having early dialogue around urban planning, transport planning and utility planning will give us the best outcome for the city.
So if you're talking grass playing fields and trying to keep the place cool, does that mean pumping water in, or does it mean recycling water? Or obviously a mix, but what sort of mix?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a blend, and it will be horses for courses depending on where you are. The traditional way of servicing the city has been to bring water down from Warragamba, and it's been to pump wastewater to the coast and take it to the ocean. Clearly in the Western City, that's not going to be possible, and we will have to reconceptualise what it means to keep water in the catchment and what it means to reuse water. So it's not a one-use product, it's not a one-use resource. Genuinely treat it as a really valuable resource given the challenges that Western Sydney will have with such a population growth.
Well, let's go to Danny, who runs the Western Sydney Area Health Service. Massive demand, of course. You've got the big project there at Westmead. How do you see Western Sydney developing? There's massive, massive projects happening now. You must look and wonder how you're going to keep up. Are you keeping up, and do you get enough information about what's happening around you?
We get plenty of information about what's happening around us. One of the things that characterises our business in the context of this conversation today is a very extensive relationship network that we have built up over the last 3 to 4 years. So one of those being Transport for New South Wales, who we worked with very, very closely over the last 3 years on the light rail project, for example, at Westmead. But let me come at your question from a different point of view. So one of the big themes today is the theme about numbers. The numbers of people that you are trying to move in particular locations or between locations. And so we think about numbers and movement from 3 points of view. One, in terms of the design of the facilities that we are responsible for building. That is how internally and around those facilities you deal with people and movement and the numbers of movement. Secondly, we think about how people get to and from our facilities. Now, that has been a significant challenge in Western Sydney, and I don't need to elaborate on that because most people understand the issues around the limitations around public transport and issues of congestion. And the third, which is a bit underplayed and has not been amplified as much today as I thought it might have been, which is the value of managing movement to managing talent. So if we can actually crack the issues of moving people well and that being associated with their sense of amenity in the lifestyle that they enjoy between home and work, we are in a very good position to attract high quality talent to our health precincts, and that is in large part one of the key objectives that we have. Westmead, presently around about 20,000 people there. That is going to have a significant uplift through to 2036, multi-billion-dollar investment at that place. One of the objectives there is for us to continue to be in the heavyweight division, contributing to medical science, and one of the only ways in which we can do that is to continue to attract high-quality talent to somewhere like Westmead. That is going to be influenced by the extent of comfort or discomfort that they experience and that their families experience in managing movement.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, and I'll go back to Maryanne, because we often talk about the WestConnex going west, but going from the east to the west, and if we're blunt about it, you talk about talent. Are we talking about people living along the coastal strip who are unwilling to go and work at Westmead because it's such a punish just getting to the start of the M4 and battling your way up Victoria Road, that with WestConnex finished, even with the toll, you're going to go to the start of the Cross City Tunnel and go to Westmead without a traffic light? Is that what you're saying? Is that, I know that's a Dorothy Dixer for you, but is that something you see happening?
Look, you know, the business case is fairly clear, even with the widened M4, which is simply putting an additional lane each way on the existing section of the M4 for about 7 Ks. People are saving 18 minutes in, you know, 7 Ks. That's pretty good in peak hour. And, you know, eventually people will be able to also do that from the Blue Mountains into Haberfield, for example, without any traffic lights. So, yes, that's definitely going to have an impact. I think there is no silver bullet, and that's why making sure that people from across both public transport sector and the private sector who are helping to deliver motorways and rail and so on, that they come together. It's an integrated solution. That's the only solution that we can have. Somebody said earlier today that public transport also relies heavily on roads, and it does. Whether that's light rail up the side of Victoria Road or on Parramatta Road, projects like WestConnex are actually helping to enable that. Taking up to 50% of the traffic off Victoria Road, for example, when Stage 3B is completed. In parts of Parramatta Road, there'll be almost half the traffic taken off there as well by 2031. So it is about an integrated solution, and when we've got great precincts like Westmead, where we can attain the best talent from around the world, they need to know that they have an opportunity to have a good lifestyle, and those elements of livability and sustainability are just critically important. And, you know, it can be done. Projects like WestConnex are not just about the tar on the road. We're delivering 18 hectares of new open green space across the west. And, you know, that's 18 new football fields, if you want to put it in that context. So it's about doing it well, it's about planning it well. I think that's why Greater Sydney Commission and their approach is having, you know, getting such great traction, because they are working with all of the key stakeholders to make sure that it's a holistic approach to the way in which we plan. And I think everybody is in agreement. We do need to have the transport infrastructure in place before we start to really look at how we expand housing, and then also having the social infrastructure to support that as well.
There's another question on that which I'll get to in a moment because they're coming in on the SMS, but I want to ask Jonathan Myers, would Keolis Downer consider using a new Western Sydney community as a trial zone for exclusive autonomous buses? Would that be a possibility?
We would if legislation allowed it, which it doesn't at the moment. So I think autonomous vehicles are definitely coming. We're involved in several trials at the moment, small shuttles, and bigger vehicles will come in due course, but not quite yet.
Would have to be on the smaller back streets, would they, to start with?
To do it right now, we'd still need legislative support to be on public roads right now, but I think that's coming. It's being contemplated.
Maybe a bridge too far in the short term, though.
It's just a question of working through the safety issues and the legislation, but the technology can do it, that's for sure.
Can I go back, and I'll ask Maryanne this, but I'll ask you all this, because this is a question to do with road pricing and the tolls, which everyone raises, and everyone, I think, would agree if in a perfect world we'd get rid of the tolls and we'd have road pricing on all of the roads. Is that politically possible? Is there any way we could ever start again?
If anybody out there has the answer to that, I'd gladly take your advice. You know, we can talk about various models of funding infrastructure, and in order to get some level of equalisation across, whether it's motorways or rail or whatever it might be, there would be a lot of work involved in that, and obviously with concessions already granted in place, it would be pretty messy to undo all of that. I think, though, what we do need to explore is making sure, again, that we're open to disruption when it comes to financing models for infrastructure. And it can't always just be taxpayers, it can't always just be user pays. We need to ensure that there are horses for courses, but we also need to make sure that we keep the door open to different ideas and opportunities for the financing.
Can I ask Ian Hunt from the Moorebank Intermodal, this massive new project that's going to be there, a lot of jobs, the size of the Sydney CBD. We've talked about trucks coming off the roads. What impact will it have in that area? Because there's obviously community concern about noise and the impact of cars on the roads, and particularly of the trucks that'll be leaving the centre. What assurances can you have, because you're proceeding with it now, and how much of that environment is going to be affected?
There's a lot of questions in there, John.
Yeah.
I'll start with the...
Well, just the noise issue, because across the river, are people going to be able to hear it through the night?
They might be, but not at levels that will be disturbing to them. There's been a lot of study of this, a lot of modelling of the noise, and that's been reviewed by EPA and the Department of Planning and Environment and the Planning Assessment Commission. It's recently been through a legal challenge to the planning approvals. So we're feeling pretty confident that the noise mitigation measures will be sufficient to deal with that problem. There are other impacts. Traffic is one that we're often confronted with, and it's a balance between the overall reduction in traffic across Sydney. 60,000 fewer kilometres a day travelled in Sydney generally because of this, but necessarily an increase of traffic locally in and around the terminal itself. Again, we feel that that's manageable. To put some context on that, when we're fully developed in about 10 to 15 years, our contribution to the traffic on that piece of the M5 running past the terminal will be about 3%. So that's not insignificant, but it's not the huge numbers that people are perhaps anticipating. To balance all of that, to come back to the opening of your question, phenomenal numbers of jobs as a consequence of Moorebank. Directly on site, when it's fully developed, about 6,800 jobs. That's mainly in the warehousing, and just to put some context on that too, when I mention those sort of numbers, people immediately think, storemen and packers, low grade, low education roles where the degree of automation on the site, there'll be smart logistics roles, people with maths degrees working out how all these algorithms, the Uberisation of the freight industry is happening. So that's 6,800 jobs on the site. Another 2,000 to 3,000 jobs in and around Liverpool, just as a consequence of it being...
How will they get to... Have you done in your planning how they're going to get to work? So will they drive? Will they catch the train?
They'll take WestConnex.
Yeah, well, they'll take WestConnex.
We have had to do a public transport plan to get people in through buses as it is, because there's no direct connection to the rail system, but the majority will come in their cars. And that's really a nature of the 24-hour operation, shift work and so forth.
Can I just move to Danny, just from the health perspective? All this economic activity is enormously beneficial. What about the health impacts of that? Are we taking enough cognizance of that?
I'll think about that question from 2 points of view. One point of view is that health is a really big player in any regional economy. So if you take somewhere like the Westmead Health Precinct, Deloitte have done a study which projects that with the ongoing development that is possible at Westmead, some of which has already begun, there is the potential for almost a $3 billion uplift in the Parramatta Westmead economy. So from the point of view of it making a contribution to local domestic economies, health is a really important player. From the point of view of the way in which issues around congestion, lifestyle, we heard this morning from Chris, Western Sydney, unfortunately, is one of the key diabetes hotspots of Australia. You are twice as likely to have diabetes in Western Sydney as you are if you live in Mossman. But one of the things that I think is also missing from this conversation is we are focused on trying to manage movement of people to overcome things like congestion and also to increase the options that people have for moving to meet their lifestyle objectives. One of the other things that's missing in this, and I really enjoyed the pitch by the woman from Uber, where she tried to introduce another dimension to our consideration about how to manage movement and decrease congestion. One of the things that's missing in the conversation, though, is to try to stop movement altogether, or at least in part. So looking out further, and this is another way of coming to your question, a lot of healthcare in the future will occur at home. And one of the things that we haven't discussed very much in this conversation and is underplayed more generally is the underinvestment in information technology to better enable and more quickly in the future a lot more care to be occurring at home, which is possible via technology today. Now, I'm not saying that places like Westmead or Liverpool become redundant, but I am saying that the technology is there for a lot of post-acute care to actually occur at home, not requiring people to come back to these hospital destinations. So in this conversation about movement, managing movement, options for doing so, including Uber, we need to put in the ingredient of no movement at all through improved information technology.
All right. Can I just ask also, and there's a question here, this is, I'll throw this one at Paul Higham from Sydney Water, because, and I wanted to ask you how much information you have about population so that you can plan for the water that's going to be required, but you also mentioned how dry it is. This question's talking about flooding impacting Western Sydney growth and the prospect of that happening down the track. You obviously look at what's happening with your dams, what the prospects are, so where are we with that, and are we properly accounting for it?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we're going to have a really hard look at in terms of population growth is the way that we build the density that is going to come, and clearly wall-to-wall, roof-to-roof housing creates a flood problem. You know, you're going to have large quantities of water on generally impermeable surfaces. So how that enters the environment, how that impacts the community, we do really need to think about water in that much more integrated way. And maybe building on the comment here around diabetes and the active transport that a blue-green grid and a blue-green corridor could create, trying to solve a flood or potential storm flooding problem with a blue-green grid corridor problem that gives us the urban amenity and the lifestyle that people are seeking is what we mean about the whole integrated water cycle and the integrated urban planning to actually deliver the end outcomes that we're all seeking for the community. South Creek is a really good example of, 1.1 million people going into the South Creek system by 2036. How do you actually keep that river system healthy? How do you actually make the most of that amenity value and plan for that is going to be a really key objective in the next few years. And having foresight that by 2036 it's going to look like this, how do we plan for that today such that we're on the pathway to that end state and beyond? Rather than trying to plan for it when it arrives in 2030, 2035.
Right, well, we're just about out of time. Can I just go up the panel and ask you each then, just quickly, maybe in 30 seconds, your vision for Sydney, Western Sydney, how you think it is developing and how you think it might look in 20 years' time, Maryanne?
It's a good question. I think with the amount of population growth, we are a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of what we need to achieve in order to make it truly a really livable city. So we need to get cracking. But I also think with development like Western Sydney Airport, with the Moorebank and the agribusiness sector, the medical research, technology, the whole aerospace sort of piece, it's a really exciting time for Western Sydney. And with 1 in 10 Australians already living there, and I think I heard yesterday that 1 in 10 Australians actually lives within 5 kilometres of Rooty Hill RSL. So there's a good tip for where you might want to invest. I think it is a really, really exciting time, and in 20 years, I hope that the vision that has been discussed here today and the very many projects that we are investing in, that they'll have come to fruition, and the 3 cities concept will be a success.
Ian, just quickly with you and your view.
I think given Moorebank and the airport and the increasing importance of getting the freight task right, I see a vision for Liverpool in particular, but Western Sydney generally, to be a very high-tech, modern, robotic freight logistics centre of excellence.
I'll turn the question on its head and challenge people to imagine failure. What would failure look like? Failure would look like us not continuing to cooperate in the way in which we have for the last half a dozen years. The sense of, and that has been one of the themes that has come through today by a number of speakers who have said, compared to days gone by, there has been such a great deal more institutional and intergovernment cooperation over the last half a dozen years. Failure going forward would be the loss of that cooperation and the loss of us having a shared vision for the future.
Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, an equitable city really, and what do I mean by that? Well, clean rivers in places of clean beaches, green parkland, recreational sites, high protected value ecology, and protection against urban heating and the urban heat island. And I think if we plan early and we plan together, we can achieve all of those outcomes.
And Paul? Trams, more trams. Do we call them trams or light rail?
Light rail, I think, but I'll go with Danny, and the thing we really need to crack in the short term is how to keep the collaboration going and allowing someone to be in charge whilst continuing to work together. And I think it's up to all of us as we started to continue the dialogue, or where there isn't dialogue, open it and keep working at it.
Very interesting. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for listening, and for those who sent questions in as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks.